All right. Well, good morning. We started 1 Corinthians 9 last week, and the first part of that is about still talking about Christian liberty and freedom, but kind of from a different perspective. This time, Paul talks about how him and others who taught and preached the gospel had the right to receive wages from those that they preached to. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't, that he talked about. He, at Corinth, because there was a faction there that was anti-Paul, he did not take money from the church at Corinth because it would just add fuel to the fire for those that were against him. And he talks a lot more about that in his second letter that he writes to the church at Corinth that we have. But and this is kind of where we finished last week, verses 14 and 15 of 1 Corinthians 9 says, "Even so the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. But I've used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done so to me. For it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void." And so, because again of the potential for problems at Corinth, he did not take money from them, even though he took money from lots of other congregations. They didn't have the factions at those other congregations like the one at Corinth. So it was a matter of liberty. He could take wages from churches or he could not. So there was the freedom. But now he emphasizes the importance of preaching the gospel regardless of the circumstances. Verse 16, "For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel." Paul was under a divine command, if you will, to preach the gospel. And if he didn't preach the gospel, he knew there would be people who didn't hear the gospel who would be lost because Paul didn't preach the gospel. And of course, at that time, there was basically only one way to preach the gospel, and that was in person. Today, we have all kinds of ways to teach and preach the gospel, but back then there was one. That was it. And so by the time the New Testament was finally written, and then copies started to be made and distributed, then people could have the gospel with them in written form. But at this time, only parts of the gospel were written down. So face to face, in person, was the only way. And so Paul said, I don't have anything to boast about or be arrogant about or anything else in preaching the gospel. It is something that I must do. He says, necessity is laid upon me. I mean, I must do this. If I don't, people will be lost. That's the point he's making. People will die in their sins if I don't preach the gospel. So he says, it doesn't make any difference whether I take money from Corinth or not. The point is, there's people in Corinth that need to hear the gospel. And that's what he was stressing, was how important it was. Paul was given that divine command. We have it recorded in a lot of places. He was given visions, about what he needed to do and how important it was for him to preach the gospel and to take the gospel to all different kinds of places. Of course, he was inspired so that everything he taught and preached was the truth, came straight from the Holy Spirit. All the apostles had that same command, though. They were all under the guidance of the Holy Spirit and were to take the gospel wherever they went. So it was very important, and it didn't make any difference to Paul how much he suffered because of it. He was still going to preach the gospel, period. And of course, that that command, the commission that we have given in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is given to everybody. I mean, we all want to do what we can in the way we can in reaching the lost. And like I said today, there's lots of different ways to do that, whereas in the first century there really wasn't. So he goes on in verse 17 by saying, "For if I do this willingly, I have a reward." And of course he knew that. You know, at the end of Timothy, in 2 Timothy 4, he talks about how he had fought the good fight, he had finished the race. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. And so he knew if he was faithful to do it and kept running the race like he needed to run it, that there would be a reward, you know, the crown of life. It's called the crown of life, the crown of righteousness. I think it's one place called the crown of glory. So if he did it for the right reasons, and this was very important, he would have a reward. But notice what it says. But if against my will, I've been entrusted with the stewardship. Paul had a responsibility to do it. And so if he did it against his will, in other words, he hated doing it, but he did it anyway, then Paul could very well be lost because of his insincerity and dishonesty. So he needed to be faithful. He needed to do it, like he says, willingly. The idea was, don't do it unless you do it willingly. He would face an accounting. So it was very important that he had the right motives. And of course, that's true with us too. We have to have the right motives regardless. So what is my reward then? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. So like I'd already mentioned, he didn't take money from Corinth because of the possibility of those anti-Pauline people there causing more trouble. But he did take money from lots of other congregations because it wouldn't cause problems in those congregations. So it all depended. He had the freedom, the liberty, which is what this chapter is about, to take wages or not take wages, but he still needed to preach the gospel whether he received wages from them or not. And that's what he was focusing on. So he says, "For though I be free from all men, I've made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more." So he wants, I think what he's really wanting to emphasize here is he knows that there's a reward, but he wanted to sacrifice himself if necessary. Like he says, "I've made myself a servant to all." You know, it was being a servant to Paul was something that meant a lot to him. It wasn't about getting glory from people or anything like that. That's not what he wanted. He wasn't doing it for glory. He was doing it because the church at Corinth needed to hear what he had to say. And he was, he wanted to be free from men. And again, he didn't want people at Corinth to think that he was doing this just for money. That's why he wasn't taking money from them. He didn't want that. So, now, would someone read 20 through 22 for us? Okay? Yes, 9, 20 through 22.
And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews to those who are under the law, as under the law that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men that I might by all means have save some. Sorry.
Okay, these verses have been misused, all right, sadly, but of course, Paul his ethnicity was Jewish. We know all about that. And he says, first of all, he became as a Jew. All right. Why? So that he might win Jews. He never did anything that was against the gospel of Christ. In other words, when he did anything, at one point he, I think it takes an oath or something with some of the people. Well, that there wasn't anything wrong with that under the law of Christ, but he would certainly not do anything that was against the law of Christ. And that, of course, was what was important. And the idea was all of this, he would do what was necessary so that it wouldn't offend people unless they were offended because he did something according to the gospel of Christ. All right. He would never participate in anything that violated the law of Christ. All right. If people were offended at that, well, they would just be offended. But he didn't unnecessarily offend people. That was the thing that was important. Practices that did not violate the law of Christ, that were harmless, he would go ahead and do if it would help the Jewish people. Or if it would help, he goes on without law, without the law of Moses, all right, because everybody's under law, as he says, not being without law toward God. Everybody's under God's law, regardless of who they are, like he mentions. So in verse 21, he talks about the Gentiles, those who were not under the law of Moses. So those people who came out of that background. So he's basically saying it doesn't make any difference who I am trying to teach. I will do what I have to bring them to Christ as long as it doesn't violate the law of Christ. He would never, ever do anything like that. Where did he go usually when he went into a city? Where was the first place he went? Yeah, the Jewish synagogue. All right. He didn't go there to worship in a Jewish sense. He went there to teach people the gospel. That's why he went there. And so again, he would never do anything that would go against the gospel, the law of Christ. But he would do other things that would help promote the gospel, help promote Christ, whether it was to Jewish people, Gentile people, didn't make any difference. That's what he would do. So there was always law, regardless of who it was. There was always a law that people were under. Period. There was always a law, but he would never ever do anything against the law of Christ. His concern, first of all, was to not violate the law of Christ, and then second of all, it was to win people to Christ. And those were his priorities. Number one, never violate the law of Christ. Number two, try and win people to Christ without violating the law of Christ. That's something he would never ever do. So, law of Moses, the law of Christ, the Gentiles. So he went to everybody. It didn't make any difference who they were. All right, Jew or Gentile, he didn't care. His concern was converting them to Christ, to the law of Christ. That's what he wanted. Like he says, to the weak I became as weak that I might win the weak. It was all about winning people to Christ. He says, I've become all things to all men that I might by all means save some. Paul would not today go into a drinking establishment and start drinking alcohol with people to draw people to Christ. He wouldn't do that. because his first priority is not violating the law of Christ, and that would violate the law of Christ. So he didn't do everything. He did things that were lawful to win people to Christ. And that's the point of what he's talking about. He wants people to be won to Christ. And so he would do anything and everything as long as it was lawful to Christ. Now, if he did something lawful to Christ and people were offended by it, well, that was just too bad. I mean, he did lots of things that made people mad. But they were lawful. They were good things. If people got angry or offended at that, well, that was their problem. They had to take that up with God. But he would do things that were lawful. He wanted to win people to Christ, but he would never, ever do anything against God or against Christ. So as long as these things were innocent in and of themselves, and it didn't conflict with the gospel, he would do it if it would help win people to Christ. So he ends this little section by saying, "Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you." That was his goal. All right, for the gospel's sake. Again, whether he denied himself or whatever, that was fine. If he had to deprive himself of something, okay. But his goal was to always please the Lord, everything he did. He finishes the chapter in verses 24 through 27 talking about the race. Well, that's what our sermon's about today, so we're skipping that for now. I thought that would be an appropriate sermon, is using that